curious about Emacs, you may have heard of it. Well, I'm going to try to impress you. Are you already impressed? Wanting to get started? I've got some ideas on what might be your easiest bet. Now, if you already use Emacs, I may not be able to help too much, but I do have a couple of new minor modes that you might find useful. First, story. Once upon a time, a coworker of mine asked what editor I was using when we were doing a screen sharing session. I replied, "Oh, that's just Emacs." Emacs, huh? That's what all the hipsters are using. Hipster? Never thought of myself as trendy, even in the nerd underworld. Gray beard, maybe, but not hipster. But he was pretty adamant that lots of young programmers use Emacs. Surprised enough to poke around, found that he was right. Seems like younger engineers who have their choice of programming environments were not only using Emacs, but also extending and creating really cool things. So I thought I would mention why something so old might prove to be useful to you. Now, the details of my life are quite inconsequential. Well, let's just say I used a lot of programming languages and operating systems over the years. But for the last 25 years, I've always had Emacs running. Sure, it wasn't always my primary editor, but it was always there, at least let me take notes. Originally, I would grab a 132-column VT100 terminal, start up Emacs, and start splitting the screen into what we called windows. Here I'd start up a shell in one, IRC in another, debugger, etc. But that was then. So why Emacs? Emacs may be the oldest successful open source project. It was a poster child for the GNU project long before Linux, and yet it's still actively enhanced and extended year after year. Now, if like me, you often find yourself using many languages for your project, then you may appreciate Emacs's breadth of capabilities. I've tried to follow Phil Sung's ideas for giving 3 reasons for Emacs' continued success, and I'll show off how easy it is to deeply customize Emacs, then I'll show some of the easy automations, and then some of the cool extensions that I use. I don't want to compare Emacs to other editors. I mean, if you're happy and productive, that's great. Keep using that finger memory. However, I am surprised how many people feel that customizing an editor amounts to clicking buttons in a preferences pane. Emacs is different. It's an editor you can really craft and bend to your will, not to what somebody else thinks you want. Now, I'm not talking about macros. I mean, yes, Emacs has those, but I want to show you how you can program Emacs with very simple and maybe a contrived example. I mean, right now, if I hit Control and then O, it will insert a line below the cursor. But what if you want to insert a line above the cursor? So, every feature is really just a function. So you can start up a Scratch editor like this and type Emacs commands in the form of Lisp. So what I'm going to do is just type in a function here. I'm using a templating system, and that's why I'm able to type this a little bit quicker than what you would otherwise. But I'll call this function insert line before, and I put the word my in a slash, well, just so I can distinguish it between other people's things, so that you don't have name collisions, since all functions are essentially in the global namespace so that you can directly call them. Now, for arguments, let's not have any for the moment. I'll come back to that though. Now, this little function here, called interactive, just separates the functions that are used by other functions and those that you call directly. So I want to make sure this is interactive. Now, what do I need to do? Oh, one thing, if you do have something that's interactive, you should be able to put essentially some documentation as the first thing in the function. I'll type something like that. Yeah, I preloaded it. Alright, now let's get back to what we want this to do. It should take like 3 steps. First, wherever the cursor is, I'll move to the beginning of the line, and then I'll insert a carriage return. Then I just want to go back to where I was. Okay, now first of all, you're probably thinking, carriage return? What if I'm editing a MS-DOS file or, maybe a Unicode issue or something along those lines? Well, okay, so Emacs has a different function called newLine, and that essentially will insert a new line. Now, any function, see how I've got the cursor next to the parenthesis, and so it's highlighting that entire parenthesis, that entire expression. If I hit Control X and then E, it actually executes it, so I can see what it does, and it inserts a new line. Perfect. Okay, but now let's go back to where I started. Now, Emacs has another other function called save excursion. Now, save excursion essentially stores what your state is now, executes a few things as you know that you pass in as parameters, and then goes back to what it was before. That's just exactly what I need. So I move these two things inside, close up my function. I think I'm ready to rock and roll. All right, Control X, Control E, and now I have essentially evaluated this function and I can try it out. All right, I need an example here. So let's get a couple of lines here. I'm going to go to the queue. Okay, so here I am on this queue, and I should be able to put a line in between this and not move my cursor at all. That's my goal. Now, I want to run this function, so you do meta x, and then you just type it in. My insert line before, and I can hit tab to complete it. Return. Perfect. That's just what I want. However, you don't want to do meta x my insert line before every time you want to just put a line before your cursor. So let's bind it to some keystroke, some key binding, some key chord. Yeah, let's see. The way we do it is with the global set key command. And I'll just bind it to Control, Shift, and O. And that's what this section right here tells me. The C is Control, the S is Shift, and the O is just, well, the letter O. And here we go. So I just moved down here, do Control E, and now I've defined that and ran it. So let's go back up here and move back to my queue, and let's try Control, Shift, and O. Perfect. Just what I wanted. Let's move back up, because I want to try something more. Now, each function can can take a parameter. So let's type in times. What this means, and my interactive thing should be AP, meaning I take a parameter, and newLine here will take a number of times. So what this does here is if I hit any a control and a number, it'll pass that number to this function when it calls it. Let me show you what I mean. Let's go back to my queue. I type in Control 6 and then Control Shift O. Dang it. I forgot to evaluate it. Alright, Control and X. Let's try that one more time. Okay, Control 6, Control Shift O, and there we go. We have 6 lines being inserted. Now, my point to all of this is just to show you just how easy it is to customize Emacs and extend it in Lisp and in such a way that you can kind of see why people write Twitter clients in Emacs and mail clients and all sorts of things. Next, I want to show off some of the standard text editing capabilities. I mentioned Vim Golf because I think it's a great idea to master your tools, and Tim Vischer has produced a series of interesting videos of him trying to beat the VI records with Emacs. While this sort of practice can be useful, don't read too much into it. Vischer considers Control-Alt-X to be one keystroke since it's pressed at the same time. However, some may call that 3 finger presses. Anyway, let me show you some new features that have been recently added to Emacs by hipster programmers that I did not use 20 years ago. First, let's create an HTML file. In fact, what would be nice is if I'm editing this HTML file, I actually see what's being done. Here's a little magic I'll use that actually runs a web server within Emacs, and a little bit of JavaScript running here in my browser will be able to view it. Kind of cool and quite useful. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to use a minor mode called Emmet to actually write a bunch of HTML with something that looks kind of like CSS. So, UL, you know all about that. Pound, let's call it fruits. Dot li dot, oh, I don't know, fruit, and times 5. Okay, so this little CSS kind of will get translated to this HTML. And that's exactly what I want, so I hit return, and I have a bunch of, well, list items. Okay, now normally you would think that you could make a macro to change this kind of stuff. For instance, if you hit F3, and then I can hit return, tab, and then I could search for this to get in position. And if I hit F4, that ends the macro. Now if I hit F4 again, I can just go through and create a bunch of changes. Now that's great if everything is exactly the same. But let's suppose it's not the same, but close. Well, first of all, I need some data, so let's type in a few. Apples, oranges, bananas, because everybody likes bananas, right? Grapes, and kumquats. There we go. All right, so here I have some fruit that are all fairly similar, or at least how they look is. All right, let's pop up here. And if I go to something that is the same on each one of these things, I can do Control-Shift-Dot to create more cursors wherever it matches. Now I have a whole bunch of little cursors that I can select some words, copy it to my buffer, move around, ID, and paste, and lowercase that, and type item, and get rid of the S, and now they match all my CSS tags. I don't know, that's pretty amazing. Now another feature that Emacs uses quite a bit is the concept of a REPL. Now a REPL, you may be familiar with it. It stands for read, evaluate, print, and then loop. What it does is it allows you to start up some engine in some other language and run commands in it. Now in this case, I'm using a language called Clojure. Let me make this REPL a little bigger. So up above I have Clojure code, but down below I actually have an engine running, and Emacs has created a little window with a connection to it. This allows me to not have to jump over into a terminal. I can just stay right within Emacs and use all of Emacs's key bindings. I can type in 42. Hey, I can type in hello world. And I can evaluate math expressions here. So this allows me to kind of explore functions and libraries that this language happens to have available. But that's not usually how you want to run it. Generally, it's up here where you're typing in code. Here I've got a function called factor. And let me just make that a little smaller. And like I was doing with the Lisp code, I can do a little expression or a little key binding to send that to my REPL. Now this factor question mark is now in my engine down below, which allows me to come over here and run some other things like little tests to validate that my function actually works. Now, each language has to be supported differently, and some obscure languages